My name is David, I'm 29 years old, and this story took place during a short flight, just 70 minutes long. I'd been traveling a lot lately and was completely drained, looking forward to some quiet time by the window seat I had intentionally booked in advance. I've always preferred the window. It gives me a sense of control over my space, and I enjoy watching the clouds drift by. The plane had a 2-2 seating arrangement, and as I reached my row, I immediately noticed something unusual. A little boy around 7 years old was sitting in my window seat. Next to him on the aisle was a man I assumed to be his father, likely in his early 50s. Across the narrow aisle, a woman and a younger girl sat, presumably his mother and sister. For a moment I stood there, confused and tired, my boarding pass still in hand. I politely indicated the seat number to the father. He looked up at me and asked if I'd be willing to swap seats so he could sit next to his son. He mentioned that their other seat was directly behind ours. At first I didn't respond. I was processing his request while weighing my options. The aisle seat wasn't appealing to me. It never has been. I don't like the constant traffic of people brushing past or needing to get up every time someone needs to use the bathroom. I simply wanted to sit in the seat I'd chosen and paid for. When I finally replied, I told him I would only agree to swap if the other seat was also a window. He said it wasn't. It was an aisle seat. I shook my head and told him I preferred to keep my seat. This was where the tension began to bubble. The man, who introduced himself as Peter, sighed audibly when I declined his offer. He turned to me again, this time with a forced smile, and tried to explain why it was important for him to sit next to his son. "He gets nervous during flights," Peter said. "It's just an hour or so. Surely you could manage in the aisle seat for a little while." I could hear the pleading tone in his voice, but something about it also felt pushy, like he expected me to just give in. I looked over at the boy. He seemed calm enough, clutching a small stuffed animal and swinging his legs back and forth against the seat. "I understand," I replied, "but I really booked this seat specifically. I'm not comfortable in the aisle." Peter's smile faded, replaced by a thinly veiled look of irritation. He leaned back slightly, glancing at his wife, who was observing the exchange in silence. She said nothing, only raising her eyebrows as if waiting to see what I'd do. Peter shifted back toward me and asked again, this time with less patience. "Are you sure? You really can't sit in the aisle just this once?" "I'm sure," I said firmly, keeping my tone neutral. "I booked the window seat for a reason." There was a pause. Peter looked down at his son, who was still focused on his stuffed toy, and then back up at me. His expression shifted slightly, and I could sense his frustration beginning to surface. "So," he said slowly, "do you want to sit next to my son instead?" I didn't respond immediately, but I could feel the atmosphere beginning to shift. I looked Peter directly in the eye, trying to stay calm but firm. "I don't care who I sit next to," I said. "I just want the window seat I reserved." My voice wasn't raised, but I made sure my tone left no room for negotiation. Peter sighed again, louder this time, and began to stand up. "All right," he muttered, turning toward his son. "Come on, get up." As the boy shuffled out of the seat, clutching his stuffed animal, Peter leaned closer to me and spoke just loudly enough for me to hear. "You're a very nice person," he said, sarcasm dripping from every word. Then, as if to clarify, he added, "I mean, not a very nice person." I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden shift in his tone. I could feel heat rising in my face, not from guilt, but from irritation. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, like he was trying to shame me into compliance. "Excuse me?" I said, stepping into the row to let him out. "It's none of your business," Peter snapped, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. "You could have just been polite and swapped." "Polite?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you're the one who needs to be polite and to behave yourself." Peter stopped for a moment, blinking as if he hadn't expected me to push back. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I held his gaze, refusing to back down. His son had now stepped aside, waiting quietly with his toy. Peter glanced at him, then back at me, before stepping out of the row entirely. "Fine," he said flatly, gesturing for his son to follow. I sat down in my seat, heart pounding, trying to settle into the small space that had suddenly become charged with tension. As I settled into my seat, Peter wasn't done. Standing in the aisle, he addressed no one in particular, but made sure everyone around could hear him. "Can you believe this guy?" he said, gesturing in my direction. "All I asked for was a simple swap so I could sit with my son, and he said no." I didn't respond, but I could feel the eyes of nearby passengers darting between us. Across the aisle, his wife Maria sat stiffly, her expression unreadable. She didn't step in to support him, but she also didn't stop him. Peter kept talking, now looking down at me directly. "It's just a window seat. What's the big deal? I thought people were supposed to help each other out." I turned to face him, keeping my voice even. "I don't think it's unreasonable to want to keep the seat I specifically booked." He threw his hands up in mock exasperation. "Wow, okay, fine. Enjoy your seat. Hope it's worth it." I could feel the tension spreading through the cabin. People in nearby rows were glancing over, some openly staring. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while a flight attendant at the far end of the plane seemed to notice the commotion but didn't intervene. Peter finally sat down in the aisle seat behind me, but not before letting out a loud sigh and muttering something about selfish people. I didn't catch every word, but the tone was clear enough. I leaned back against the headrest, doing my best to block it out. The atmosphere in the small cabin felt heavier than it should for such a short flight. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the boy glance back at me before turning toward his father. As the minutes passed, I could feel Peter's frustration radiating from the seat behind me. He wasn't yelling, but he certainly wasn't being quiet either. I heard him muttering under his breath, his words barely audible but clearly laced with irritation. Every so often, he would shift loudly in his seat or sigh heavily, making sure his presence was felt. At first, I tried to ignore it. I focused on the small window to my right, gazing out at the tarmac as the plane finished boarding. But his constant muttering was hard to tune out. I glanced toward the flight attendants, who were still busy stowing luggage and preparing for takeoff. Then, as if unable to help himself, Peter leaned forward and spoke loudly enough for me and half the row to hear. Unbelievable. Some people just have no decency. I turned around, looking him directly in the eye. "Excuse me?" I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. He leaned back slightly, smirking. "Oh, I didn't say anything to you. Just making an observation." I felt the heat rising in my chest again. "Look," I said, my voice steady, "I don't care what you think about me, but I suggest you behave yourself. There's no need to make this into a bigger issue than it already is." Peter's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of surprise. It was clear he hadn't expected me to confront him so directly. "Behave myself?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "Yes," I replied, holding his gaze. "You've made your point. Let's just move on." There was a pause, a charged silence between us. Peter opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. Finally, he leaned back in his seat without another word. The tension lingered in the air, but at least the murmuring had stopped. I turned back toward the window, trying to find some semblance of peace as the plane finally began to taxi toward the runway. Just as I thought the situation had settled, someone from the row behind me spoke up. "Excuse me," the man said, leaning into the aisle to catch Peter's attention. "I can switch seats with you if it helps. I'm in the aisle next to yours." For a moment, the cabin went silent. Peter looked at the man, his expression softening slightly as he registered the offer. "Oh," he said, almost caught off guard. "Well, that would work. Thank you." The man, whose name I later learned was Mark, quickly stood up and gestured for Peter to take his seat. Peter wasted no time moving into the aisle and motioning for his son to follow. As the boy squeezed past me to join his father, Peter avoided looking in my direction entirely. I glanced at Mark, feeling a mix of relief and irritation. On one hand, the situation was finally resolved. On the other, it felt like my decision had been bypassed without my consent. Mark took the now vacant seat beside me, giving me a brief nod as he settled in. "Thanks for this," Peter said to Mark, his tone suddenly cordial. "It's really important for me to sit with my son." Mark just smiled and waved it off. "No problem," he said, adjusting his bag under the seat. I sat quietly, unsure how to feel. While I appreciated the resolution, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd been cast as the villain in a drama I hadn't asked to be part of. The energy in the cabin began to normalize as people turned back to their own seats and conversations. I stared out the window, hoping the rest of the flight would pass without further incident. As the plane ascended, I couldn't help but replay the entire exchange in my mind. The tension from earlier still clung to me, and the resolution hadn't provided the relief I expected. Instead, it left a bitter taste. I looked over at Mark, now sitting in the aisle seat beside me, seemingly unbothered. He had pulled out a book and was engrossed in it, his demeanor calm and collected. I envied his detachment, but couldn't stop stewing over the way things had unfolded. Peter and his son were now sitting directly behind us. I could hear snippets of their conversation, Peter's voice lighter, even cheerful, as he spoke to his son about what they would do when they landed. It was a complete turnaround from the simmering hostility he'd shown just minutes before. I felt irritated, not because the boy and his father were now sitting together, but because of how it had all happened. I hadn't agreed to this swap. Mark had offered, sure, but it wasn't his seat to give up. And Peter's attitude still grated on me. His entitlement, his passive-aggressive remarks, they lingered like an unresolved argument. I glanced out the window, watching the clouds pass by, trying to ground myself. It wasn't about the seat, I reminded myself. It was about the principle. I had reserved that spot for a reason. I wasn't obligated to accommodate someone else's lack of planning, especially when it came at my expense. Yet I couldn't entirely shake the doubt creeping in. What if I had been too rigid? Would it have killed me to sit in the aisle seat for just 70 minutes? As much as I wanted to dismiss the thought, it lingered, making me question whether I'd handled the situation as well as I thought I had. By now, the cabin had mostly returned to normal, but I couldn't find that same sense of calm. The frustration clung to me, unresolved. As the plane cruised at altitude, I found myself unable to let go of the nagging doubt in my mind. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. I kept coming back to one question: was I being unreasonable? I thought about Peter's request again. On the surface, it seemed simple. Just move to the seat behind, and the problem would have been solved. But it wasn't that straightforward to me. I'd gone out of my way to book a window seat. I'd planned ahead to avoid exactly this type of situation. Still, I couldn't ignore the optics of it all. From the outside, it must have looked like I was being selfish, clinging to a preference while a father just wanted to sit with his son. I imagined how the other passengers saw me, a stubborn man refusing to do a small favor. But wasn't it my right to say no? I hadn't created the problem. Peter had, by not arranging their seats properly. Was it fair for him to shift the burden of his oversight onto me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how layered the situation was. It wasn't just about the seat or the request. It was about boundaries, expectations, and how we navigate these moments of social pressure. I opened my eyes and glanced at Mark, still absorbed in his book. He had stepped in and resolved the issue, but in doing so, had made me feel even more out of place. I wondered if I'd lost more than just my peace of mind in this situation. Had I also lost the chance to demonstrate empathy? Or had I simply stood my ground as anyone would? The questions lingered. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Throughout the rest of the flight, I noticed occasional glances from other passengers. Some were fleeting, while others lingered a moment too long. I wasn't sure if they were judging me or simply curious about what had unfolded. Across the aisle, Maria sat quietly, flipping through a magazine. Her body language was reserved, but I caught her looking in my direction once or twice. She didn't say anything, didn't even frown, but her silence felt heavy, almost like a quiet verdict. I wondered what she thought of the whole situation. Did she think her husband had handled it poorly? Or did she agree with him and think I was the unreasonable one? Behind me, Peter and his son seemed to have settled in comfortably. The boy's small voice occasionally rose above the hum of the engines as he asked questions about the flight. Peter answered in an easy, cheerful tone, as if the earlier confrontation had never happened. It struck me how quickly people move on. For Peter, the problem was solved. He was where he wanted to be, and that was all that mattered. But for me, the tension lingered. I couldn't help but think about how moments like these shape people's perceptions of us. To the other passengers, I was likely the stubborn guy who wouldn't swap seats. The nuances of my reasoning, the importance of personal boundaries, and the principle of fairness were probably irrelevant to them. I found myself sinking further into my seat, feeling the weight of those silent judgments. I had stood my ground, but at what cost? I shifted my gaze back to the window. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, a stark contrast to the tight confines of the plane and the invisible social battlefield I felt trapped in. For the rest of the flight, I tried to focus on the view, ignoring the whispers of doubt and the stares that I couldn't quite shake. As the plane began its descent, I stared out the window, watching the city come into view below. The tension had eased somewhat, but the thoughts in my head hadn't quieted. I replayed the situation yet again, as if analyzing every moment would bring me closer to an answer. Was I right to stand my ground, or had I been unnecessarily rigid? I thought about Peter's snide comments, his passive-aggressive tone, and how he had escalated the situation. But then I thought about his son sitting there quietly, likely oblivious to the underlying tension. Had I let my frustration with Peter cloud my judgment? Should I have just taken the aisle seat and avoided all the conflict? It wasn't like the aisle was unbearable. It just wasn't my preference. But then again, I hadn't asked for this situation. I wasn't the one who failed to plan ahead. The plane touched down smoothly, and a ripple of relief swept through the cabin. People started gathering their belongings, the air buzzing with the usual post-flight energy. Mark stood up, smiled politely at me, and reached for his bag. Peter and his son were already preparing to leave, and for a moment I thought about saying something to him. Maybe an apology for the way things unfolded, or an explanation for why I held my ground. But I didn't. Instead, as I walked off the plane, I turned the question over to you. Did I do the right thing? Should I have given up my seat to make things easier for their family? Or was I justified in keeping what I had planned and paid for? I'm not sure anymore. You tell me, was I the jerk in this situation?